Greetings! Welcome to Nina's World. This podcast provides a short respite from the trials and tribulations of everyday life. We're going to step back in time to the 1950s and 60s. And now, our story. Nina celebrates Valentine's Day. How many cards did you get? February crept over the windowsill. Valentine's Day at the Maple Avenue Elementary School was on its way, and the second grade students in room 205 were discussing the big day. Mrs. Wagner turned the holiday into a learning opportunity, beginning with each student being given a shoebox to cover with brown paper. Nina tried to fold the paper and tape it together as she had been instructed, but kept getting the cellophane tape stuck to her fingers. Buddy offered to hold the paper in place while Nina used both hands to rip small pieces of tape from the dispenser. Charlie had already finished his box and placed it on the windowsill. Without making a big deal about it, Charlie and Nina asked Buddy how they could help him cover his shoebox. With just a little assistance, his box was covered and added to the ever-increasing pile. Charlie said what other students were thinking. "Okay, that's done. Now what, Mrs. Wagner? What do we do with the boxes?" Mrs. Wagner said, "Well done, children. That's all we have to do today. We'll do a little bit more tomorrow." "But what are we going to do tomorrow?" Charlie asked. Mrs. Wagner simply smiled that mischievous smile. "Come to school tomorrow, and you'll get that answer to your wonderful question." Nina whispered to her group, "That Mrs. Wagner sure knows how to make things intriguing." When they entered the following day, the students, some still with their coats on, rushed to the counter to examine the boxes, the other newly added items that were there as well. Each box now had an opening cut in one end and the student's name written below it. 24 boxes, 24 students. There was also a large piece of cardboard, painted black, and long, thin stripes of cardboard cut away so that it looked like bars. A white paper at the top said the words, "Post Office." Charlie lifted it up in front of him, crying, help me, I'm in prison." Buddy stood close to him, saying, "We're innocent, call a lawyer." The students were laughing and saying things like, "You two deserve it," or "Too bad for you," or one girl saying, "You're going to get in trouble if you don't put that down." Mrs. Wagner was looking and just said, "What a lot of chatter. Boys, please put down the cardboard and everyone get ready to start the day." When they asked their teacher a barrage of questions, Mrs. Wagner just smiled that smile that meant something good was about to happen. But to the children's disappointment, it remained a secret until after reading was read, math was calculated, lunch was eaten, and recess was played. When they returned to the classroom, Mrs. Wagner asked for some volunteers. Children were selected and given instructions on how to tape the post office sign on top of the table so it was standing upright. Other students gathered the shoeboxes and placed them in stacks on both sides of the grill. Stepping back, Mrs. Wagner admired the room 205 post office. She tilted her head to the right, then to the left, placed her hand under her chin as if it needed support. She addressed the students, "It's good, but is it good enough? I know that mailboxes should be in alphabetical order." She looked at her students. "Stephen, Betsy, Patty, and how about you, Buddy? Can the four of you figure out how to place the mailboxes in alphabetical order? There's more than one way to do it, I'm sure. The children, excited and proud to be chosen, scrambled to complete the task. Several mailboxes tumbled to the floor. Lots of laughter, students jumping up and down at their desks, while the chosen few managed to tumble and fumble and bumble their way to the finish line. Buddy doing his usual mock bow, pretending to take off a hat and bending at the waist. Betsy and Patsy curtsied. Steve just sat down, admiring their work, got up quickly and readjusted a few boxes that looked crooked. Robbie cried out, "Wait a minute! Where's Mrs. Wagner's mailbox? And if it's a post office, where are the stamps?" Sudden silence as the students had no answers to those questions. I think I can solve some of those problems, Mrs. Wagner said, and she brought a large shopping bag from behind her desk. She lifted out sheets of stickers that looked like real stamps, envelopes of play money bound in a rubber band, an ink pad and a stamper, a cornucopia of thoughtfulness from Mrs. Wagner. She explained how each child would have a chance to buy or sell stamps, to figure the cost, to make change, and place Valentine cards in the correct mailboxes. Nina was excited as her classmates, but didn't think her mom could afford to buy Valentines for her or her sisters to give to classmates. She felt a pin piercing the small hole in her world and wondered if homemade cards could be as good as the store-bought ones. Even so, Nina thought her teacher's idea was a super-duper spectacular and brilliant plan. When Valentine's Day finally arrived, the atmosphere in the classroom was electric. Yes, there was work to be done in the morning. And there's work to be done even right after lunch. But when they came in after recess, the room mothers had treats arranged on a long table as the bubbling boys and girls took their seats. Mrs. Wagner announced that a special visitor would stop by and to meet all of them. The children were abuzz, barely able to keep their composure as Mrs. Wagner answered a tap at the door. In came a man dressed in a white uniform, his hat tucked under his arm, and a broad smile on his face. He introduced himself. "Good afternoon, boys and girls. My name is Lieutenant Charles Wagner, husband of the most wonderful woman in the world, your teacher, Mrs. Wagner. I'm very happy to finally meet all of you after hearing stories since September." He stopped and introduced himself to the room mothers as Mrs. Wagner blushed and placed her hands just above her heart. "Mrs. Wagner asked me to act as Postmaster General. My job is to help the room mothers hand each of you your Valentine's mailboxes." The children could not contain themselves any longer, shouting out various greetings, Charlie running up to him and exclaiming, "We have the same name. I'm Charlie. Do people call you Charlie too?" "Oh, so you're Charlie. Very happy to meet you." Not to be outdone, Buddy was next in line. "Do you have a cart to sell ice cream? I like vanilla ice cream covered with chocolate." Gales of laughter from the grown-ups as the children wondered what was so funny. "No, I don't sell ice cream. I'm a member of the United States Navy. My job is to help keep America safe." Oohs and ahs from the children, particularly the girls and room mothers, as Lieutenant Wagner explained a bit more. Asking the students to stay seated would have been useless because more children were already gathering around the visitor. He shook the hand of each girl as they giggled their way through introductions and gave a salute to each of the boys. And what's your name, young lady? Nina had stood back, feeling reticent. Of course, if she had thought about it, she would have known there had to be a Mr. Wagner, but the thought he actually existed was astounding. And Mrs. Wagner living in a house? Mrs. Wagner doing grocery shopping? Oh my goodness. It was all so unexpected. Nina, she croaked, clearing her throat and said, "My name is Nina." Lieutenant Wagner held her hand for a moment longer and said, "So, you're the famous Nina. I'm particularly proud to make your acquaintance." Nina stood speechless. Her brain was turning somersaults, thinking, famous? How could I be famous? I'm only a second grader. The internal soliloquy ended when Mrs. Wagner asked the room mothers and her husband to hand the children mailboxes and snacks. It was a glorious afternoon with music on the record player, chocolate cupcakes with pink icing, a scoop of vanilla ice cream, and Valentine's to open. Some classmates were walking around the room, looking at each other's cards, saying thanks, and, well, a few girls counting and comparing the number of cards each had received. Susan stopped at Nina's desk. "How many cards did you get, Nina?" Nina didn't answer. She didn't care about any of that nonsense because her teacher had written a note on her Valentine. To Nina, a special little girl. I'm glad you're in my class. Nina sat smiling, her heart expanding with happiness. Yes, everyone loved Mrs. Wagner. She was so kind. But Nina decided that no matter what anyone else said, she was sure that she loved her teacher the most. The end. Thank you for visiting with us today. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to this podcast and share it with everyone you know. Return next week for another story from Nina's World. This story was written and read by Christine McKee, with gratitude to Dr. Ethel Ratkin of Bucks County Community College for editorial consultation and encouragement. Additional heartfelt support from family, friends, and members of my writing groups. Technical support was provided by Mr. Dan Tarrant of Personally Catholic. Sound engineering by Mr. Andrew Kimlock of AK Productions. May you embrace peace in your heart, in your home, and in your world.